Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this underlying expectation of just absolute precision.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
treated like engineering almost. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, they put the X-ray up on the light board, and you see that jagged, undeniable white line.
It's right there.
Yeah, exactly. The doctor points to it and says, there it is. That is the reality of your situation, and here's exactly how we are going to fix it.
Mm.
I mean, nobody wants a doctor who wings it.
Oh, definitely not.
You wouldn't want a doctor who looks at an X-ray and says, well, my heart tells me your arm is fine, so just go play some tennis.
Yeah.
We demand precision because, well, the stakes are our physical bodies.
And we understand the gravity of that.
Right. But what if the greatest risk in your leadership or your teaching or really any time you step up to guide someone else isn't what you don't know? What if the greatest risk is what you think you already understand?
Wow. Yeah, that's a really heavy thought.
Think about it. When you are leading a small group or teaching a class of adults or even just trying to pass down your worldview to your kids, we often operate with this strange assumption.
Which is?
Well, we assume that just because we've heard a story or a concept 100 times, we actually understand it.
Yeah, that is the quiet, creeping danger of familiarity. We conflate recognizing something with actually comprehending it.
Oh, totally.
It is a bit like driving the same route to work every single day for 10 years. Every turn, every pothole, every stoplight.
Right, you could drive it in your sleep.
Exactly. But if someone asked you to draw a topographical map of the route or, I don't know, explain the civil engineering behind the bridge you cross every day, you would be completely lost.
You'd have no idea.
Right. You are familiar with the surface, but ignorant of the substance. And when it comes to guiding other human beings, like when you are standing in front of a room of people who are looking to you for truth, that assumption of competence becomes genuinely dangerous.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today. We are looking at a stack of incredibly profound source material that explores a discipline you might not talk about at, normal dinner parties.
Probably not.
It's called hermeneutics. And for those who might not use that $10 word every day, we are talking about the science and the art of interpreting texts accurately.
It's a big word for a very foundational concept.
Yeah. And the material we are diving into goes way beyond just an academic exercise.
Mm-hmm.
We are looking at the heavy ethical responsibility of teaching.
Which is something a lot of people take for granted.
Definitely. So our mission today is to uncover how to handle source material. And specifically, we are looking at ancient sacred texts like the Bible. We want to see how to handle them with absolute craftsman-like precision.
Precision is the key word there.
Exactly. We are looking at how you can move from just transferring dry information to facilitating true life-altering transformation in the people listening to you.
It requires a massive, massive psychological and spiritual shift. I mean, most of us are conditioned by our modern education systems to view a text as something to be conquered.
Conquered? What do you mean?
Well, you read a book to extract the data, right? To pass the test, to master the material. You are in charge of the text.
Oh, I see. Like cramming for finals.
Exactly. But dealing with a sacred text requires flipping that dynamic entirely. We have to move from viewing the text as something we master to viewing it as something that has the authority to master us.
And that is exactly what makes these sources so disruptive. They aggressively challenge the water we're swimming in right now.
It really do.
Because we live in an age that is just obsessed with speed.
Yeah.
If you are anything like me,
Yeah.
you want the quick takeaway,
Yeah.
the viral soundbite, the 3-step life hack.
Give me the summary in 15 seconds or less.
Exactly. We are drawn to charismatic speakers who can give us an emotional rush in a quick video. But this material is calling time out. It is demanding something radically countercultural. It's asking for slow, disciplined, almost agonizingly careful observation.
And we desperately need that friction because, well, our era is defined by unprecedented information overload.
Oh, for sure.
Everything ever written is available instantly. Sermons, devotionals, massive theological commentaries. You can pull them up on your phone while you're just standing in line for coffee.
Which feels like a good thing, right?
It feels like it. But we have to realize that unlimited access has not produced deep accuracy.
That's a great point.
In fact, the modern landscape has manufactured a very subtle, very real trap. And that trap is confidence without competence. Because you can Google an answer in 5 seconds, you feel an unearned confidence in your grasp of the material.
Right. You read a Wikipedia summary and suddenly you're an expert.
Yeah. Leaders today can easily replicate what they have heard on another show or read on a blog without ever actually testing the integrity of the idea themselves. So, as we dive into this today, our focus is going to be heavily on the why and the how behind faithful interpretation and effective adult learning.
Let's start with the why, which brings us to the actual weight of the words we use. And the source text makes a profoundly bold claim right out of the gate here. It says, words shape souls.
They do. They aren't neutral.
Right. They don't just float out of your mouth, hang in the ether for a second, and disappear. They build worlds. The text argues that the modern crisis in leadership is not a lack of communication skills.
No, it's not about stage presence.
Right. It's not that leaders don't know how to use a microphone or tell a funny anecdote. The crisis is a severe lack of accuracy.
This is a foundational theological claim that really underpins everything else in this material. If you trace the biblical worldview all the way back to the opening lines of Genesis, what do you see?
You see God speaking.
Exactly. You see that words create reality. God speaks, and light exists. God speaks, and the oceans divide. In that framework, the divine word is not merely expressive, it is effective. It accomplishes the thing it names.
Okay, so how does that translate to human words?
Well, if humans are made in that image, as the text asserts, then our words, in a derivative but intensely real way, also carry formative power. We see this psychologically all the time.
Give me an example.
Sure. If a parent repeatedly tells a child they are worthless, those words literally shape the child's neurological development and their inner reality. They build a prison out of vocabulary.
Wow, a prison out of vocabulary. That's heavy.
It is. Conversely, when a community is taught distorted theology or given half-truths about who God is, they don't just get a trivia question wrong. They begin to drift in their actual lived-out practice.
Right, it affects their actual lives.
Yes. Their marriages, their ethics, their resilience and suffering, all of it is malformed by inaccurate words.
So when you stand up to teach a sacred text, whether to a congregation of 1,000 or just a living room of 5 people, you aren't just sharing an interesting opinion or doing a book review.
No. You are stepping into an entirely different category of communication. Our sources highlight a terrifying distinction between speaking about God and speaking for God.
Okay, unpack that difference for me.
Anyone can share religious ideas. You can sit at a coffee shop and share your personal reflections on the universe. That's totally fine.
Just casual conversation.
Right. But when a leader opens a sacred text and declares to an audience, this is what this passage means, they have crossed a massive threshold. They are making a representational claim.
They're claiming to speak on behalf of the author.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are essentially saying, I have done the work to understand the mind of the author, and I am now representing the voice of the divine to you. That carries an immense, almost crushing representational weight.
Yeah, you don't want to mess that up.
If you misinterpret that text through laziness or just being in a rush, you do not just misinform your listener. You actively misform their spiritual architecture.
This is where we run headfirst into what I think is the most common trap for leaders today. And sources call it the trap of sincerity.
Oh, sincerity. It's such a tricky one.
Because sincerity feels like the ultimate safeguard, doesn't it? If you are a leader and you are highly passionate, if you genuinely love the people in front of you, if your motives are pure.
Society tends to give you a pass on the details.
Exactly. We say, well, their heart was in the right place. But the text is uncompromising on this point. Sincerity is not a safeguard against error.
Not at all.
A leader can be incredibly sincere, weep on stage, love their community deeply, and still completely misread a text, leading everyone right off a cliff.
Sincerity is incredibly compelling. It disarms critique. It gains trust quickly because, like you said, the motives are usually pastoral and good.
Yeah, nobody wants to criticize the nice guy.
But the source material draws a hard, non-negotiable line between two critical concepts. You have exegesis, which comes from a Greek root meaning to lead or draw out.
Drawing out the meaning.
Right. Exegesis is the painstaking work of drawing the original meaning out of the text. And then you have eisegesis, which means reading your own personal meaning into the text.
Ah, okay, so projecting onto it.
Exactly. Sincere leaders fall into the trap of eisegesis constantly. They approach a passage and instinctively ask, what does this mean to me? Or, more dangerously, how can I use this verse to comfort this grieving person sitting in front of me right now?
Okay, let's make this concrete. Think about Romans 8.28.
Oh, perfect example.
This is perhaps one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible. It says, God works all things together for good for those who love him. I mean, I have seen this cross-stitched on pillows, plastered on bumper stickers, quoted in 1,000 greeting cards.
And if a sincere leader relies on eisegesis, if they read their own desperate desire to comfort a hurting audience into that text, they will inevitably teach that this verse is a cosmic guarantee of a comfortable life.
Right. They'll say, everything happens for a reason. You're going to get a promotion out of this.
Yeah, they will look at someone who just lost their job or received a terrible medical diagnosis, and they will say, don't worry, God promises that this bad situation will immediately resolve into personal success or material prosperity or just a happy ending.
But let's look at the actual reality behind those words.
Mm-hmm.
If we do the exegesis, if we draw the meaning out, we see that that interpretation completely ignores the author's original context.
Completely.
The Apostle Paul wrote that letter to a community in Rome that was facing or about to face brutal, blood-in-the-streets persecution. We were talking about people losing their homes, their freedom, and their lives.
Yes, the original intent of that passage was about God's sovereign redemptive purpose in the absolute darkest pits of human hardship.
Not about getting a new car.
Exactly. The good Paul is talking about is the ultimate conformity of the believer to the character of Christ, securing their eternal standing. It is absolutely not an entitlement to earthly ease.
So consider the fallout of this. If you teach the eisegetical version, the cross-stitch pillow version, what happens when real, devastating, unexplainable suffering hits that community?
What happens when the job doesn't come back or the illness is terminal?
They collapse because their entire theological foundation was made of sugar glass. They think God failed them, or they think their own faith wasn't strong enough to manifest the miracle.
It's tragic.
The sincerity of the teacher actually set them up for a crisis of faith.
Precisely. They are left spiritually defenseless because their expectations were built on a misinterpretation. The leader was perfectly sincere. They genuinely wanted people to feel hopeful in that specific moment.
But the long-term spiritual consequence of that inaccuracy was profound confusion and disillusionment.
It makes me think of an analogy. Eisegesis is like walking up to a mirror.
A mirror.
You are technically looking at the text, but all you are really seeing is your own reflection. You see your own cultural biases, your own political leanings, your own immediate emotional needs staring back at you.
I love that. And exegesis.
Exegesis is like looking through a window. You have to clean the glass, get close to it, and look through the text to see the reality outside of yourself.
Even if you don't like the view.
Right. You are trying to see what is actually out there in the landscape of the author's intent, even if that landscape is stormy, challenging, or deeply uncomfortable for you to look at.
Faithful interpretation is the rigorous daily discipline of ensuring the text remains a window. But I have to push back on this a little bit.
Go for it.
Because we live in the real world, right? And human emotions are messy.
Yeah.
Let's say you are a youth pastor. You have a teenager sitting across from you who is deeply depressed, maybe even having thoughts of self-harm.
A really high-stakes situation.
Absolutely. In that moment, if you use a verse slightly out of context, but the sheer emotion and sincerity of your delivery genuinely helps that kid feel loved and steps them back from the ledge. Why is the technical accuracy so incredibly critical?
You're asking if the empathy matters more than the mechanics.
Yeah. Doesn't the heart of that moment matter far more than the academic mechanics of first-century Roman context?
That is the ultimate tension, isn't it? The immediate pastoral need versus the long-term truth. The sources address this exact emotional friction, and they use a very sharp grounding analogy to cut through it.
What's the analogy?
Imagine a surgeon who deeply, profoundly loves their patient. Maybe it's their own child on the operating table. Because they love them so much, they want to relieve their pain instantly.
Of course they do.
But a loving surgeon does not just start cutting based on a sincere feeling of empathy. They don't just guess at the diagnosis because they are in a rush to help.
No, that would be insane.
Right. They rely on cold, hard precision. They look at the scans. They rely on their years of grueling medical training, and they execute the procedure with absolute accuracy because the stakes are life and death. Empathy without surgical precision is malpractice.
Empathy without precision is malpractice.
Wow. In the same way, the sources argue that sincerity without accuracy in teaching is effectively love without truth. It might feel deeply comforting in the moment to that teenager, but it builds their survival on a faulty foundation.
Because what happens when they go to college?
Exactly. If the foundation is a misapplied verse, what happens when they encounter an intellectual challenge to that verse later in life? The comfort evaporates. True love tells the truth well.
A leader who truly loves their audience will care enough about their long-term survival to do the hard work of discovering what the text actually means before applying it as medicine.
That's exactly it.
That completely shifts how you view the hours you spend in preparation. It means this tension between what we want the text to say and what it actually says requires us to fundamentally rethink what the text even is.
We have to understand the nature of the glass in that window we talked about.
Which brings us to our next major point from the sources, the dual nature of the text itself.
To interpret Scripture faithfully, you have to embrace a foundational theological paradox. And you cannot resolve it, you have to hold it in tension.
Okay, what's the paradox?
The text asserts that Scripture is entirely 100% divine revelation and simultaneously entirely a human document.
So it's fully inspired, carrying eternal authority, yet it did not drop out of the sky on golden plates in modern English.
Right. It was written by human hands in specific human languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, inside very specific ancient cultures addressing real historical crises.
What's fascinating here is how the source material compares this to the incarnation of Jesus.
Yes, the incarnational analogy is incredibly helpful here. Just as Orthodox Christian theology describes Christ as fully God and fully human, not 50-50, but 100-100, the biblical text must be treated with both supreme reverence and rigorous diligence.
So if you lean too far one way or the other, things break down.
Exactly. If you deny Christ's divinity, you lose his ultimate authority. He just becomes a nice moral philosopher. If you deny his humanity, you lose his accessibility. He becomes a ghost who can't relate to human suffering. The text operates the exact same way.
If we ignore either of those natures, the divine or the human, we end up distorting the whole thing. The sources point out two major dangers here, and I think we have all seen these play out in real life.
Definitely. What's the first one?
First, you have reductionism. This is when you treat the text as merely human. You strip away the divine inspiration. When you do this, its authority is immediately diminished.
It just becomes literature.
Yeah, it becomes just another ancient document like the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh. It becomes a voice in the crowd, a negotiable opinion that you can take or leave. The text becomes something you judge rather than something that has the authority to judge you.
And the opposite extreme, which is perhaps even more common in certain religious circles, is equally dangerous. That's over-spiritualizing.
Over-spiritualizing. How does that look?
This happens when you emphasize the divine nature so much that you ignore the human context entirely. You forget that the Apostle Paul was a real guy sitting in a real prison who was probably cold and asked for his cloak.
Right. You treat it like a magical spell book.
Yeah. When you over-spiritualize, you start turning every historical detail, every number, every ancient geographical reference into a hidden mystical code. You strip away the literal historical meaning in an attempt to find some deeper spiritual secret.
And ironically, that deeper secret usually just ends up being your own eisegesis sneaking back in.
Always. Ignoring the divine reduces its authority. Ignoring the human distorts its meaning into pure fantasy.
So, practically speaking, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's say you are sitting down at your kitchen table at 6 a.m. with a cup of coffee, opening the book.
Yeah.
How do you physically and mentally approach reading a text with this dual nature?
The source material demands what it calls a listening posture.
A listening posture.
This is a profound shift in your spiritual and intellectual disposition. Interpretation, fundamentally, is not about conquering the text. It is about allowing yourself to be conquered by it.
That requires a lot of humility.
Immense humility. You have to sit down and explicitly acknowledge, I bring biases to this table. My culture has blinded me to certain things. I might be completely wrong about what this passage means.
It's hard to admit that.
It is. It also requires patience to linger with a difficult, abrasive passage instead of skipping ahead to the comforting Psalms. And it requires submission, the willingness to let the text confront your lifestyle, correct your political assumptions, and challenge your personal ethics.
It's about intentionally silencing the urge to speak,
Yeah.
the urge to tweet your immediate thought before you have truly listened.
We live in an attention economy that rewards the hottest, quickest take. The faster you can generate an opinion, the more engagement you get. But the faithful interpreter has to aggressively quiet their own voice and the deafening voices of their cultural moment to actually hear the cadence of what the ancient text is saying. You have to assume the posture of a servant to the text, not a modern editor of it.
Okay, so if we can establish that proper posture, that humility and patience, how do we actually do the work? Good intentions and humility are great, but we need a practical methodology.
We need tools.
Right. We need a way to ensure we are actually listening to the text rather than just hearing the echo of our own thoughts in the room.
Mm.
And this is where the sources get incredibly practical. They outline a very specific craftsman's toolkit for this,
Yeah.
known as inductive Bible study.
Inductive Bible study. It is a strict, disciplined, three-step method. It is essentially an architectural framework designed to prevent exactly the kind of eisegesis we have been analyzing.
Is rigid for a reason.
Very rigid. The steps are observation, interpretation, and application. You must do them in that exact order, and you cannot skip a step without compromising the integrity of the whole structure.
The text notes that the greatest error modern readers make, the thing that derails us 99% of the time, is rushing straight from reading a verse to applying it.
We all do it.
We read a chapter in Proverbs and immediately ask, what does this mean for my Tuesday? We skip the foundational process entirely.
When you skip from reading to applying, you are almost guaranteed to project your own life onto the ancient words. Let's break down the first step to stop this. Observation.
Okay, observation.
What are we doing here?
Observation asks the painstakingly simple question, what does it say? Not what it means, just what it says.
Just the facts.
Just the facts. This requires you to drastically slow your reading speed. You are acting like a detective at a crime scene. You are looking for repeated words. Is the word grace used 5 times in 2 paragraphs? That's a clue.
You're looking for patterns. Yes. You are looking for literary structures, if-then statements, and contrasts. You are identifying the actual subjects and verbs. Who is speaking? To whom are they speaking? Are they indoors or outdoors? You are gathering the raw, objective facts of the text without allowing yourself to ask what they mean yet.
It sounds so basic, almost like middle school grammar. But it is incredibly difficult because our adult brains automatically want to jump to conclusions. We want the dopamine hit of the aha moment.
It is deeply counterintuitive to the modern brain. It requires immense cognitive discipline. But once you have squeezed every drop of observation out of the text, you move to the second step. Interpretation.
Okay, so from what does it say to what did it mean?
Exactly. Interpretation asks, what did it mean? Past tense. What did it mean to the original audience? This is where you build a bridge over the gap of 2,000 years. You are trying to uncover the authorial intent.
Why this author to this audience at this time?
Right. Why did this specific author write this specific letter to this specific group of people in the middle of this specific historical crisis?
And then, only after those 2 grueling, time-consuming steps do you earn the right to move to application.
That's right. Application asks, how should this change us today? This is where truth moves from academic knowledge to lived obedience.
So translating the ancient principle to modern life.
You take the timeless theological principle you painstakingly uncovered in the interpretation phase, and you translate it into contemporary action for your life, your family, or your community.
To really cement how vital this order is, let's walk through the example the source material provides. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10.
A classic.
Right. If we just read that story and rush straight to application, which is what most of us have heard in Sunday school, we just conclude, be nice to people who are hurt on the side of the road. Help old ladies cross the street.
Which is fine. It's a nice moral sentiment, but it completely neuters the explosive rate of the text.
It turns a radical kingdom ethic into a generic bumper sticker.
So let's run it through the inductive method to see the difference. In observation, you refuse to jump to the moral. You look at the text and you notice the dialogue.
What's the setup?
A religious lawyer asks Jesus a hyperspecific question. Who is my neighbor? You notice that Jesus responds with a story featuring 3 very specific characters: a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan.
And you observe the physical actions.
Yeah.
The religious leaders passing by on the other side, the Samaritan bandaging the wounds and paying the innkeeper.
Right. Then we move to interpretation. We have to understand the historical context of those 3 characters. We can't just view them as generic good guys and bad guys.
Because historically, there was intense hatred there.
Exactly. If you dive into first-century realities, there was intense, bitter, centuries-old socio-cultural and religious hatred between Jews and Samaritans. This went all the way back to the Assyrian exile and disputes over where the true temple of God was located.
They considered each other heretics.
Heretics and half-breeds. Jews would literally take longer routes on their journeys just to avoid walking through Samaritan territory.
Wow.
So when Jesus is talking to a Jewish lawyer and intentionally makes the Samaritan the hero of the story, the one who actually fulfills the sacred law of love while the Jewish religious elites fail, it is a shocking, highly offensive twist to his original audience.
The meaning of the parable isn't just help people.
No. The meaning is that the kingdom of God completely dismantles our deeply entrenched ethnic and religious prejudices. It means that the definition of neighbor is violently expanded to include our historical, cultural enemies.
It completely flips the script. And only then can we move to application. Now, the application isn't just a generic call to donate to charity.
It's way more demanding than that.
It's a deeply uncomfortable challenge to you, the listener, to redefine who your neighbor is today. It forces you to ask, who is the Samaritan in my cultural context right now?
Yes. Who is the marginalized, despised, or politically opposed person that my culture tells me to hate, but whom Christ is commanding me to show sacrificial, bank account draining love to? It moves way beyond just physical proximity.
That is the raw power of the inductive method. By anchoring yourself in the ancient reality first, you protect the integrity of the original message. And as a result, you deliver a much more profound, life-altering application to the modern listener.
It's so much richer.
It reminds me of a Greek word mentioned in the text that perfectly encapsulates this. It's orthotomy. The Apostle Paul uses it when he writes to Timothy, telling him to rightly handle the word of truth.
Orthotomy. What's the literal translation?
The literal translation is cutting straight. It's like being a master carpenter building a house. Every carpenter knows the rule.
Yeah.
Measure twice, cut once.
Ah, I love that.
Right. In our framework, observation and interpretation are measuring twice. You measure the angles, you check the level, you ensure you understand the material, then you only cut once. Application.
That's a brilliant analogy.
If you get arrogant and just start cutting without measuring, if you rush to application, you might still manage to nail some boards together and build a structure that looks like a house.
But the foundation is off.
Exactly. Because the foundation is off by a few degrees, over time, as the storms hit, the whole structure shifts, cracks, and eventually collapses.
The precision of the cut determines the long-term stability of the house. And that critical middle step interpretation, the measuring step, is absolutely impossible without understanding the boundaries that keep our modern imaginations in check.
Guardrails.
Yes, we need guardrails, or we will just invent meanings that sound good to us.
And those guardrails are known as context. The sources hammer this point home with a brilliant phrase. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text.
Say that again, that's so good.
A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. Without context, you can weaponize an isolated verse to say almost anything you want. You can justify slavery, you can justify greed, you can justify anything if you ignore the context.
To prevent that nightmare scenario, the sources demand we look at 3 distinct layers of context: historical, literary, and canonical.
Let's unpack those 3 layers deeply, because they are the immune system of faithful interpretation. First up, the historical context.
This is the world behind the text. You have to internalize the reality that these words were spoken into specific political, cultural, agricultural, and geographic realities that are completely alien to our modern lives.
We can't just read it like it was written yesterday.
Right. Understanding the brutality of Roman occupation, the intricacies of first-century honor-shame social hierarchies, or ancient Near Eastern covenant practices completely changes how a text is read. You cannot read the Bible as if it were written by a 21st century American sitting in a coffee shop.
The source gives an incredible example of this with the Book of Esther. If you ignore the historical context, you might just read Esther as a generic feel-good motivational story about a girl who believed in herself.
The Disney princess version.
Yeah. You take the verse, "You were made for such a time as this," and you put it on a coffee mug, or use it to motivate your sales team to hit their quarterly quota.
But the reality of Esther is so much darker and more complex. It is deeply embedded in the legal, political, and cultural danger of the ancient Persian Empire.
She wasn't just a plucky heroine.
No, she is a marginalized Jewish orphan navigating the harem of King Ahasuerus, a man who possessed absolute, unchecked, lethal power and a history of deposing women who displeased him.
Deposing is putting it mildly.
Exactly. When you understand the historical peril she was in, the reality that approaching the king uninvited meant literal execution, her faith and her strategy become infinitely more profound.
It is not a story about believing in yourself. It is a gritty, high-stakes narrative about strategic faithfulness, political maneuvering, and divine providence under the immediate shadow of death.
The historical context transforms it from a platitude into a masterpiece.
The second layer of the guardrails is literary context. This is about understanding the genre you are reading and the surrounding words on the page.
Because the Bible isn't just one book.
Right. It is a sprawling library consisting of vastly different genres. You have ancient Hebrew poetry, historical narrative, legal codes, apocalyptic visions, intimate personal letters.
And you simply cannot read poetry the same way you read a legal code. If you read a poetic psalm that says, "The trees clap their hands," literally, you sound absurd.
Or treating an apocalyptic vision in Revelation, which uses highly symbolic, dreamlike imagery of beasts and dragons to describe political realities, like a chronological, historical timeline, leads to massive conspiracy theory level distortion.
Let's look at how the surrounding literary context changes things, specifically with Matthew 7.1. Judge not, lest you be judged.
Oh, this is a big one. We touched on quoting things out of context earlier, but let's dive into this. If you just isolate that one sentence and post it on social media, it looks like Jesus is issuing a blanket ban on any kind of moral discernment.
It sounds like he is saying, never evaluate anyone's actions ever.
But look at the literary flow of the text. That verse sits right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. In the very next breath, Jesus is talking about taking the log out of your own eye so you can clearly see to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
And later, in the exact same chapter, he tells his followers to beware of false prophets and to judge a tree by its fruit.
Wait, so if Jesus meant never evaluate anyone, he contradicts himself 3 paragraphs later.
Exactly. But within that literary context, he is clearly addressing hypocrisy. It is a severe warning against self-righteous, condemning judgment while ignoring your own massive faults.
It is not a command to abandon moral discernment entirely. The surrounding verses make that crystal clear, but you only see it if you respect the literary boundaries.
The third layer is canonical context. This operates on the theological principle that Scripture interprets Scripture.
What does that mean exactly?
The idea here is that despite being written by dozens of authors over thousands of years, the Bible presents a unified narrative. Any isolated verse you are studying must align with the overarching macro story of redemption from Genesis to Revelation.
It's a safety net.
It is a crucial safety net.
Yeah.
You cannot interpret one obscure passage in a way that contradicts the clear, repeated teachings of the rest of the canon. If your interpretation of one verse makes God out to be a capricious monster, but the rest of the canon defines him as steadfast love, your interpretation is wrong.
The sources mention a fascinating moment in Christian history to illustrate this: the Marcionite controversy.
Oh, Marcion. Yes.
Tell us about him.
Marcion was a wealthy shipowner in the 2nd century who essentially decided he didn't like the canonical context. He looked at the God portrayed in the Old Testament, who seemed wrathful and deeply involved in the messy history of Israel, and contrasted it with his own preferred view of the peaceful, loving Jesus of the New Testament.
So what did he do? Did he try to reconcile them?
No, he just took a theological scalpel and cut the book in half.
Wait, he just cut the book in half.
Literally. He completely severed the connection between the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. He threw out the entire Old Testament and edited down the New Testament to just the parts he liked.
That's bold.
Very bold. He created a distorted, highly personalized theology that fit his own Greco-Roman philosophical preferences. And the early church leaders realized the existential threat this posed.
They fought fiercely against it, right?
They did, ultimately affirming that you absolutely cannot understand the identity of Jesus without understanding the entire canonical history of Israel. You cannot unhitch the New Testament from the Old. The canon is a unified whole.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, but honestly, also deeply intimidating. I can hear you, the listener, thinking right now, all right, if I need to know ancient Persian court politics, or Greco-Roman honor shame culture, or the nuances of apocalyptic literary genres just to read a daily devotional without committing heresy, doesn't this make the text completely inaccessible to the average person?
It's a totally valid fear.
If I am a busy parent or an accountant, do I need to go get a seminary degree just to open the book?
It is a completely fair and necessary question. If the barrier to entry is a PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies, we have a huge problem. But the sources reframe this beautifully, moving it from a burden of exhaustive knowledge to a posture of intellectual humility.
So I don't need a PhD.
No, it does not mean you need a PhD. What it means is that you need to respect the text enough to ask questions before making assumptions. When you encounter something weird in the text, instead of just skipping it or guessing, you pause and say, I probably lack the historical context here. Let me find out.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, the sources stress that biblical interpretation was never meant to be a solo sport. The idea of the lone, isolated individual sitting in the woods figuring out the mysteries of God all by themselves is a very modern Western idea.
Interpretation is meant to happen in community. You don't have to be the lone wolf interpreter figuring out ancient Persia on your own. You have tools available.
Exactly. How do you actually do this? You buy a high-quality study Bible that provides historical notes at the bottom of the page. You read the 2-page introduction to a book before you start reading the chapters, just to get the lay of the land.
You consult trusted historical commentaries written by people who do have the PhDs.
Right. You discuss confusing passages in a small group with older, wiser mentors. You lean on the historical theology of the church that has been tested over centuries. It is entirely accessible, but it requires intentional effort and communal reliance. It is a lifelong journey of discovery, not a weekend crash course.
And while context grounds us in that ancient world, constantly pulling us back in time to understand authorial intent, there is a massive opposing force constantly pulling us toward the immediate present. The sources call this gravitational pull interpretive drift.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of our society right now, interpretive drift is the slow, subtle, almost imperceptible erosion of accuracy caused by the intense cultural demands of our time.
We live in a world that demands speed above all else. But beyond speed, it demands instant relevance and emotional resonance.
If a message isn't immediately applicable to my stress levels today, I tune it out.
This pressure is magnified exponentially by our digital culture. Think about the podcast feeds, the social media clips, the live streams.
The algorithm.
Yes, the algorithm.
Yeah.
It rewards what is provocative, simple, and emotionally validating. The sources argue this creates an enormous invisible pressure on leaders to simplify complex, rugged doctrines into easily digestible, frictionless sound bites.
And when a leader yields to that pressure, they begin prioritizing what is palatable over what is faithful. This is the danger zone.
Because the authority shifts.
When you prioritize the audience's immediate comfort, the ultimate authority in the room slowly shifts away from the ancient text and onto the audience's approval. The leader subtly, maybe even unconsciously, begins to shape and sand down the edges of the message to fit what the culture already wants to hear.
Instead of allowing the text to confront and critique the culture, the text is domesticated to serve the culture. The drift is rarely a sudden dramatic rebellion. A pastor doesn't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to abandon the truth today.
It's an erosion. It's a million micro-compromises.
The sources give an incredibly relevant example of a leader preaching on the concept of justice. The cultural pressure right now is massive to define the word justice by whatever social or political movement is currently trending on your social media feed.
Right. And the temptation for the leader standing on that stage is to take the biblical word justice, which is a massive, complex, deeply theological concept rooted in the character of God, and hollow it out.
They empty the word of its biblical weight.
Yes, and they fill it with the contemporary secular definition of the moment so that the message resonates, gets applause, and avoids controversy.
But the faithful leader, the one resisting the drift, has to hit the brakes. They have to pause, study the historical and canonical context of justice throughout Scripture, how it addresses the orphan, the widow, the oppressor, and the atonement, and let the biblical text shape the definition.
Even if that biblical definition makes the message infinitely harder, more complex, and significantly less culturally palatable to the people sitting in the front row.
Another powerful example the text provides of this drift is how we treat Philippians 4.13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We mentioned this earlier, but let's dive deeper.
It's the ultimate sports slogan.
Exactly. In a modern Western culture obsessed with individual achievement, hustle culture, and self-actualization, that verse is constantly twisted into a modern success slogan. You see athletes writing it on their shoes before a big game. You hear CEOs quoting it to justify aggressive business mergers.
What is the actual context? Let's use our inductive tools. Where's the Apostle Paul when he writes that?
He is sitting in a Roman prison cell, or at best, under strict Roman house arrest.
Right. He is chained to a guard. He is facing potential execution. He is talking about the fact that he has learned how to endure intense suffering, starvation, humiliation, and physical hardship. And he has found a supernatural anchoring contentment in the midst of absolute deprivation.
So when we strip away the grit of that Roman prison context to make it a peppy success slogan about winning a football game, we completely lose the profound depth of the passage.
We trade a sustaining, unbreakable theology of suffering for a fragile, cheap, motivational poster.
And when real suffering hits the person who believed the poster, their faith shatters. Now, I want to point out, whether you lean left or right politically, the temptation here is exactly the same.
Oh, absolutely.
We all have agendas, and we all want the divine stamp of approval on our agendas. Whether the pressure is coming from progressive ideologies demanding social conformity or conservative ideologies demanding nationalistic conformity, the leader is tempted to use the ancient text as a mascot.
You put a Bible jersey on your political view and parade it around.
Yeah, but the sources are unrelenting on this. The text must remain the authority over the culture and over our politics, not the other way around. It must be allowed to judge our agendas.
That requires immense courage. That is the core of resisting interpretive drift. And resisting that drift requires leaders to fundamentally change not just what they teach, but how they transmit this information to others.
They have to move from merely sharing facts to actually forming character, which brings us to the psychology of adult learning.
This is a fascinating pivot in the material. We move from the theology of the text to the psychology of the listener.
The sources emphasize that teaching adults in any context, a ministry, a corporate training, a book club, cannot just be information transfer. It has to be formational.
And to do that, you have to understand that adults learn fundamentally differently than children do. This is the difference between pedagogy teaching children and andragogy teaching adults.
Break that down.
Children are generally sponges. Their brains are wired to absorb facts and imitate authority figures. They will learn the capitals of all 50 states just because you tell them to.
Right, they just accept it.
But the sources point out that adult learners are entirely different creatures. They are experience-driven, problem-oriented, and internally motivated.
When an adult walks into a room to hear you teach, they bring a lifetime of baggage with them. They bring their career successes, their painful divorces, their financial stress, and their deeply entrenched political views into the room.
The primary burning question every adult learner is asking, often subconsciously, is, why does this matter to me today?
If a teaching is purely abstract, theoretical, or purely historical, it just bounces off their armor. They might nod politely, but the information is completely forgotten by the time they hit the parking lot and check their email.
Furthermore, the text breaks down that if teaching is going to be truly formational, if it's going to change how someone lives, it must engage the whole person. It cannot just target the intellect.
It has to engage three distinct centers: the mind, the heart, and the will. So how does a teacher actually hit all three targets?
Engaging the mind means helping the listener truly understand the truth of the text. That is the rigorous exegesis and inductive study we just spent so much time discussing. It is achieving clarity on what the text actually says and means.
But intellectual clarity is not enough to change behavior.
No, you must engage the heart, which means helping them love the truth. This is where the art of teaching comes in. This is where you use compelling stories, personal vulnerability, and deep empathy to stir their affections and bypass their cynicism.
And finally, you must engage the will, which means challenging them to actively obey the truth. Truth, without a specific, tangible call to action, remains a theoretical philosophy. You have to ask them to do something with what they just learned.
The sources illustrate this beautifully with a practical example. Teaching Philippians chapter 2, which is a profound theological passage about the ultimate humility of Christ. Let's look at two radically different approaches to teaching this exact same passage.
Okay, first, you have the teacher we will call the informer. The informer gets up and gives a brilliant, airtight historical lecture. They map out the geopolitical context of the city of Philippi. They break down the complex Greek syntax of the passage. They deliver a masterclass on the theological doctrine of the Incarnation.
The learners in the room gain absolute intellectual clarity. They take copious notes. But their actual lives, how they treat their spouses and coworkers, don't change one single bit.
They leave with perfectly full notebooks, but entirely unchanged hearts. The informer engaged the mind, but completely ignored the heart and the will.
Exactly. But then you have the second approach, the formational teacher. This teacher covers the exact same historical and theological truth. They don't skip the exegesis, but they intentionally connect it directly to the adult learner's messy lives.
They connect the ancient biblical call to humility to real-world modern workplace conflicts. They don't just talk about Christ's humility, they share a raw, vulnerable story about their own recent struggle with pride. Maybe a time they arrogantly dismissed their spouse and had to apologize.
And most importantly, they engage the will by inviting the listener to apply that specific teaching to a broken relationship in their own life that very week.
That is the profound difference between transferring information to a brain and forming the architecture of a soul. Yeah. Formational teacher engaged the mind with the rigorous text. They softened the heart with their own vulnerability, and they activated the will with a specific, achievable challenge.
So let's make this intensely practical for you, the listener. Let's say you are preparing a presentation for work, a lesson for Sunday school, or you are just leading a small group discussion in your living room. How do you actually structure your time so you don't just slip back into default lecture mode?
The sources outline a very practical, reproducible framework for this. First, connect the material to a real-life struggle right at the very beginning. Don't wait until the end to make it relevant. Address the adult learner's core question. Why does this matter to my pain or my stress in the first 2 minutes?
Second, encourage interactive reflection. Adults need time and space to process new information against their existing experiences. Don't just talk at them.
Use carefully crafted, open-ended questions that force them to wrestle with the text. Let them bring their doubts and their lived experiences into dialogue with the scripture.
And the third piece of the framework, which the text emphasizes heavily, is modeling. You have to model the obedience yourself.
This is perhaps the hardest part of teaching. You cannot authentically lead someone to a place you haven't been yourself.
If you are teaching a lesson on radical forgiveness, but you are secretly harboring deep toxic bitterness toward a family member, your audience will intuitively, subconsciously sense the disconnect.
The spiritual authority of a formational teacher flows just as much from their lived integrity as it does from their academic preparation. You teach what you know, but you reproduce who you are.
When a leader successfully bridges that massive gap, when they combine accurate, context-driven exegesis with this kind of holistic, vulnerable, formational teaching, it creates a ripple effect.
And that ripple effect is designed to outlast the leader's own lifetime. This brings us to our final major theme in the sources: the multiplication of truth and how to overcome the paralyzing fear of teaching.
The ultimate goal of faithful teaching, according to these sources, is not to build a massive audience. It is not to become a localized celebrity. The goal is multiplication.
It is about a constant generational flow of learners becoming teachers and disciples becoming disciplers.
The text uses the historical mentor-mentee relationship of the Apostle Paul and his young protege, Timothy, as the ultimate blueprint for this generational relay race.
Paul writes to Timothy in his second letter, and he says this incredible line: "The things you have heard me say, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others."
If you look closely at that sentence, that is 4 distinct generations of multiplication happening in one thought. Paul teaches Timothy, Timothy teaches reliable people, and those reliable people teach others.
And what is vital to pull out of that dynamic is how Timothy, who is historically young, somewhat timid, and prone to stomach issues, gained the confidence to actually stand up and do that.
The sources point out a massive relief for most of us. Teaching confidence does not come from innate charisma. It does not come from possessing a magnetic stage presence or performative flair or being the funniest, sharpest person in the room.
Which, if you are an introverted listener who gets sweaty palms just thinking about public speaking, is the best news you could possibly hear.
It should take the weight of the world off your shoulders. True, enduring confidence comes from clarity rooted in truth. It comes from the quiet, unseen, diligent preparation we talked about earlier.
It comes from understanding the text deeply through the inductive method and relying on a humble dependence on God rather than your own wit.
Think about it historically. The early Christian church did not grow from a marginalized handful of persecuted people in Jerusalem to a global, empire-shifting movement through spectacle.
They didn't have massive budgets, smoke machines, or charismatic mega communicators.
They grew through the precise, reproducible, deeply relational transmission of the word from one person to another across kitchen tables and in hidden catacombs.
But let's be honest, the fear is still intensely real. The sources explore the very real psychological fear that emerging teachers face. It is the fear of being wrong.
It's the terrifying thought of misinterpreting a sacred text and inadvertently leading people astray.
It's the insecurity of lacking formal seminary training, or the paralyzing trap of comparing your unpolished living room lesson to a veteran communicator you just watched online with perfect lighting and a team of writers.
That fear is entirely natural, and honestly, given the weight of the words we discussed at the beginning, a healthy dose of fear is appropriate. But the source material offers a profound antidote. Do not let the fear paralyze you. Let the fear drive your preparation.
Let the fear be the engine.
Yes. The fear of being wrong should intentionally foster humility. It should force you to slow down, to actually use the inductive method instead of guessing, to check your historical context in a commentary.
And most importantly, That fear should motivate you to seek out mentorship, just as Timothy sought out Paul. When fear drives you into community and preparation, it becomes a tool rather than a roadblock.
I love that framing.
It reminds me of passing a baton in a track and field relay race. Imagine you are the runner. You have the baton in your hand. If you are busy doing backflips down the track, winking at the camera, and showing off to impress the crowd in the stands, relying entirely on your charisma, you are almost certainly going to fumble the handoff and drop the baton.
The message gets entirely lost in the performance of the messenger, and when the baton drops, the race stops with you. Your generation is the dead end.
Exactly. But if you block out the crowd and your eyes are locked fiercely on the next runner, and your grip on the baton is secure because you've done the grueling, unglamorous hard work of clarity and truth in the dark, then the handoff is successful.
The baton passes safely. The race continues to the next generation. And this raises a deeply uncomfortable but vital question that challenges the core metrics of how we evaluate modern leadership in ministry. How do we actually measure success?
The sources argue forcefully that success is absolutely not the size of the crowd. It is not the number of podcast downloads, the size of the budget, or the amount of applause you receive at the end of a lecture.
Success is measured by one metric. Are the people listening to you equipped to accurately and faithfully teach someone else?
If your audience loves you, but they are entirely dependent on your weekly insights for their spiritual survival, you have failed to multiply. You have created consumers, not craftsmen.
It's about building capacity in others, handing them the tools rather than just building a platform for yourself. Multiplication is the ultimate, undeniable proof that the teaching was both exceptionally clear and deeply formational.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have dug deep into the philosophy, the theology, and the very practical mechanics of how to handle source material. Let's trace the journey we have been on together.
We started by recognizing the incredibly heavy, reality-shaping responsibility of our words, and why speaking for God is not something to be taken lightly.
We saw the absolute necessity of rejecting the comforting trap of pure sincerity, realizing that good intentions without truth is malpractice, and embracing the disciplined hard work of exegesis over eisegesis. We want windows, not mirrors.
From there, we explored the dual nature of the text, requiring both supreme reverence for its divine origin and rigorous diligence regarding its human context.
We walk step by step through the craftsman's toolkit of inductive study, observation, interpretation, and application. We established that context is the ultimate guardrail, historical, literary, and canonical.
And we examined how vital it is to resist the subtle cultural drift that constantly demands instant relevance over enduring truth.
And finally, we looked at how to move from simply transferring dry information to truly forming the whole adult learner, engaging their mind, softening their heart, and activating their will so that truth doesn't just stop with them, but multiplies across generations.
It is a demanding, rigorous calling. But as these sources remind us, it is also a profoundly joyful and sacred stewardship.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. It builds entirely on the source's premise of the listening posture and the heavy weight of our words.
This is a powerful thought.
If human words truly shape souls, and if God's words truly create reality, perhaps the ultimate measure of our grasp of the sacred text isn't how eloquently, loudly, or confidently we can explain it to a crowd.
Perhaps the true measure is how profoundly the text silences us before we even attempt to speak.
Are you allowing the text to interrogate your life, to expose your hidden biases, and to ruthlessly confront your comfort before you dare to use it to interrogate the world?
That silence is the truest essence of a listening posture.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Whether you are leading a boardroom, teaching a small group of friends, raising kids, or just reading quietly on your own in the morning, we encourage you to carry this craftsman's precision into whatever material you read or teach next. Don't just settle for what you think you already understand. Keep doing the work. Keep looking through the window.